Welcome, everybody. We are so thrilled to have you here with us. We are delighted to have you join us to talk about environmental justice, which is a strong and central commitment of the School of Social Work because it is inextricably linked to social justice. And we're very pleased to have you here for the very first environmental justice panel series. Many people have shared their time and talent and wisdom and relationships to bring this series to all of us. And so I would like to thank the Environmental Justice Student Group, a very strong student group in our school. I would like to thank the Environmental Justice Series Planning Committee, led by students Ryan Driscoll and Hannah Murphy, and faculty Mike Spencer, Stan DeMello, Arden Hellman, and Ray Williams. Well, thank you so much for bringing this to all of us. We are very grateful, and welcome to everybody joining.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rachel. And we're now going to pass it over to Michael Spencer for our land acknowledgement.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Mike Spencer. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the School of Social Work and the Dean's Office as well. I'd like to just begin by sharing with you a little land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for those of you who are not aware, is something that we do in order to take a moment to reflect upon the lands on which we live and the original caretakers of that land. And here at the University of Washington, our university stands on the lands and waters of the Lushootseed speaking people. This includes those groups, including the Duwamish, Snohomish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Tulalip, Puyallup, and other Coast Salish people. I also live on these lands and acknowledge the original caretakers, both past and present. I also acknowledge that I pay real rent to our local Duwamish group through real rent, duwamish.org. If you're interested, I myself am Native Hawaiian, and I also want to acknowledge, my own ancestors and my people, and ask them to come and enjoy this presentation today. So with that, I will turn the floor back over to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much for that, Mike. So to give a little bit of an overview, our focus today is on the topic of the intersection between environmental justice and anti-racism. And we're going to, in just a second, allow our panelists to do an introduction of themselves, but we wanted to just let you all know that if you have questions throughout this presentation, we're not going to be having people unmute themselves, but please feel free to put those questions into the chat, and I'll be following along and dropping those into the conversation as we go. We're also going to have time, the last 15 or 20 minutes so of our time together set aside for questions specifically. So feel free to put your questions in there and I will track them as we go. For anyone who's here doing requesting CEUs, we'll have a reminder at the end, but please make sure that you stick around until you get the evaluation link, as you do need to fill out the evaluation if you would like to get your CEUs. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike to do an introduction of our panelists.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say that we have a very illustrious panel today, and we're so honored that each of you could make it to our webinar today. Our students who are present, our students and our faculty who are present. I think you're in for an extraordinary event. So thank you all for attending as well. As we said, we're going to ask each member of the panel to do a brief introduction of themselves and a little bit of an overview of your current work and the programs that you're involved with. And if you just keep your introduction to about 3 minutes, and we'll start with Ray Williams, Director of the Black Farmers Collective.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everybody that put this on, and certainly thanks to the participants out there. Shout out to Ion. She's our practicum student out here at Yes Farm. So I'm Ray Williams. He is pronouns. Born and raised in Seattle. I'm mixed race, black and white. I found that in some ways you have to choose not which ancestry to honor, but which community to serve. And so here I am working on the ground with Black Farmers Collective. There's a great diversity in the African diaspora, and even within a group of African Americans, right? So that's a one main point I'd like to have folks, maybe take away from this, aside from some of that, is that we tend to be put in one box, and there's a huge diversity. And I think, in order to do anti-racist work, you need to understand that a little bit more about white supremacy. And one of the things white supremacy does is to seek to divide people. And so that's something that we're trying to do. Yes Farm is bring people together. And it doesn't have just white folks that do that work, right? There's lots of folks that are, unfortunately engaged in activities that might support white supremacy. So I started with the idea that I've been on a lot of committees, and that what can I do on the ground to help support the health of the community? And so I thought growing some food, teaching people how to grow food, getting more food access, creating a space where people could come and build community around food, all the health aspects of eating well, growing food, being outside, is sort of what drives us. And so that's what we try to create on Yes Farm. And we also have now leased 4 acres from King County out in Woodinville. So, we're able to produce more food and get that into the food system. We strive to create a inclusive space at Yes Farm, Black led, with the understanding that at certain times we have to have affinity groups. So we might say, hey, this is for this group, as we try to create space for people to flourish. And so that's the work that I've done. Started as a science teacher, ended up as a farmer and a community organizer. So here we are. Thanks for being here. Thanks for participating.
Thank you so much, Ray. Next, Heather Day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Day, use she, her pronouns, co-founder of Community Alliance for Global Justice here in our office, which is nice. I'm mostly working from home these days. And also very, very much honored to be invited to join this panel. And thanks so much to everyone at the School of Social Work who organized this. CAGJ was born out of the protests against the World Trade Organization that happened here in Seattle in 1999, which was an amazing, successful people's movement that altered the course of the WTO and contributed to them not achieving their aims. And out of that, we formed an organization that was membership based and originally wanting to focus on transforming the U.S. trade system and preventing continuation of so-called trade agreements like NAFTA. And we transformed into an organization that today focuses on strengthening the global food sovereignty movement a few years later, which is really a natural extension out of trade justice work, and do that in a variety of ways, both working in solidarity with frontline communities in Washington State, farm workers and food workers, in solidarity with tribes that are fighting against genetically engineered salmon. And then we have a kind of David and Goliath, is that the right name? So I'm doubting. Anyway, battle against the Gates Foundation, where called Augur Watch, where we are trying to expose the Gates Foundation's promotion of a so-called green revolution in Africa and working in solidarity and very much in partnership with the African food sovereignty movement. And one of the things we do is we've put out 3 different publications of Our Food, Our Right, it's called. And I just want to read a little piece that was written by the father of a student at University of Washington, Pukraj Sidhu, who helped with this project. And her father was a farmer involved in the Green Revolution in India. And in the last couple of years, there's been the largest mobilization that has ever happened in history in India. And they've won some victories, but are still fighting. And he said, if the trees on my farmland could speak, then they would tell you about the generations of farmers it took to nourish today's lush green Bollywood backdrops, about all the hands that have been calloused over the fate lines that have been tampered with and torn to paint those picture perfect sceneries. They would tell you about the corporate world that disrupted their rhyme of life, contaminated their land in the name of a green revolution, polluted their air in the name of industrialization, and poisoned their waters in the name of evolution. If the trees on my farmland could walk, then they too would uproot themselves to protest at the doorstep of a totalitarian government. That's just part of his poem, but I just thought it was really powerful in speaking towards what we're fighting against, and what we're fighting for is food sovereignty and agroecology, and I can talk more about that later. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Next, Dr. Michael Yellowbird, all the way from Manitoba. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nawa did you wake on ho dish to do? Nawa di wagon on it to wen sakarich, I'd like to just begin by thanking everyone for being here and acknowledging the territory I'm on. I'm Treaty 1 territory. I'm not in my home territory. My homelands are in North Dakota, and I'm a member of the Rikra, Hidatsa, Mandan nations. I'm he, him, his pronouns. And a lot of the work that I do today, aside from my administrative work as a dean, is I still continue to write and publish and make presentations about the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization in Indigenous communities. So I do a lot of panels like this, but I still write quite a bit. Just finished a book and working on another book about decolonizing the social work curriculum with a couple of other colleagues. A lot of my work today in decolonization focuses around the use of mindfulness and contemplative practices and what I call mindful decolonization to begin to bring together Indigenous people and allies to work on mutual problems of interest, whether it's climate, whether it's racism, whether it's white supremacy, whatever it is, and to use particular kinds of mindfulness practices, decolonized mindfulness practices that I've developed to help people come together and work together. A lot of my work really focuses on the brain and about talking about how we're doing these kinds of things, but a lot of these things don't manifest for a lot of people because people are dealing with so many other issues, so they haven't quieted their minds and trained their brains to kind of focus on I guess the issues at hand. And so that's one of the things that I do with what I call neuro decolonization, like decolonizing the mind. So I'll just say that much, and I have a lot more to say about how what happens to the brain and the environment, and on a traditional level, and also with neuroscience. I do a lot of work in neuroscience and epigenetic science and microbial science. So I'll say that much, and thank everyone for their participation today.
Well, good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you may be. I'm Jeff Smith, and I'm a Makah tribal member. My parents, my mom comes from the Makah Indian Reservation and grew up in Port Angeles here in Washington State. And my father, he's non-Indian from Newport, Oregon. And I use the he and him pronouns. So a little bit about my background. Right now I'm retired. So I just retired this last quarter. So, I graduated from UW School of Social Work in 1990. And then I worked as a mental health counselor for some tribes on the Washington coast. And before that, I lived on my own reservation for a short time and worked there. after I left there, I went to American Friends Service Committee. I was the Northwest Indian Program Director. AFSC is a Quaker organization. So I worked there 25 years here in the Seattle office, and worked with tribes in the region, primarily in Northwest Washington, but also worked on some issues throughout the region. And then I retired from there about 4 or 5 years ago, and I helped to start and found a new nonprofit called the Nakanni Native Program. And Nakanni means connector, so that was part of our work, was to help try to connect different entities, Indian, non-Indian, and to work on things such as social justice and environmental justice. So, and then when I retired, my focus is now I've been into Buddhist philosophy and meditation for quite a while, and so I want to really devote time for that, and also spending time with my mother. So, and then the projects that I'm working on, I've tried to let go of everything else except for one thing I'm still involved in, that I've been involved in since 1996, is the Intertribal Canoe Journey, and that is annual event that we usually, it takes us about a year to plan it in various ways. So in this journey, we have around 100 canoes that of tribal ocean-going canoes that travel with one concrete goal, which is to arrive at the same place in the same time. And we have a destination host, and so when we arrive there, we spend 4 to 7 days sharing our culture, celebrating, hanging out with each other. And then on the way to that place, we stop at different reservations and tribal communities, and sometimes non-tribal communities along the way, and spend the night. And we usually have to come from all different directions. And we primarily travel in the Salish Sea. Oh, there's a nice picture of it. And so the journey usually itself, before we get to the destination, usually takes about 1, 2, or 3 weeks, depending on where you start and where your canoe starts from. And we have about 4,000 people who travel. And a really important part of it is it's drug and alcohol free. And so that's kind of the concrete things about it. But there's so much that happens out of that: spiritual growth, community growth, individual growth, revitalization of culture, and so many other things that it's impossible to explain. You have to participate. So you might want to check it out sometime. Keep your eyes and ears open for it. So this year, we're going to do some smaller events depending on COVID. And in 2023, Muckleshoot is going to be the destination host, and as well as Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs down in Oregon, Central Oregon, are going to be hosting, and they'll be hosting on their traditional territories on the Columbia River. So I'm really glad to be here, and feel free to put your cameras on so we can see you. It's nice to see people, like here I am, I'm retired, and my wife's out of the country for a while, and I'm home alone, and I want to connect with people. So turn off your camera. You get to look at us, let us look at you. So thanks.
Thank you. So now we'll go into some questions, but we don't need to go in any specific order. If you we'll try to keep it as conversational as possible. And I'm actually going to go ahead and ask the first 2 questions together. You can take either part of those 2 questions, or you can bring them together. But I think that they're both relevant to each and every one of your work. So I don't think you're going to have much trouble talking about them. The first question is, what does environmental justice mean to you? And the second question is, how do you see environmental justice intersecting with anti-racist social work? So how do you see, what does environmental justice mean to you? And how do you see that as part of a larger body of work around anti-racism. Anybody want to start? And folks, at any time, if you want to put questions in the chat, Ryan's going to be monitoring our chat. And yeah, we can throw in questions and comments along the way as well, so you can join in on the conversation.
So I can start, folks. I don't know if everyone's being polite. That's what I try to do, is to be polite and let other people go. Otherwise, I turn into a motor mouth after a while. So, but let me just say this. For me, I think of environmental justice as something that I learned as growing up when I was in my tribal homelands. And that kind of justice is, we didn't use the word justice. We talked about a natural environment and a sacred environment. Where we were connected to the lands, we were connected to the plant life, the tree life, and all of it was embedded in narratives and storytelling that were told to children as we grew up. So there were certain places you didn't go because they were sacred. You couldn't pick berries at a certain place at a certain time. You had to let them sort of restore themselves. And there were natural springs that ran, and waters, of course. And those were all kind of considered very sacred, entities, right? Sentient in nature. And so, when I think about that, I think about how land was taken away from Indigenous people. They were forced off our land, and forced to deal with all the settlers, and of course all these things that were happening. And of course, there was a manipulation and the exploitation. I was just on a call this morning where I was talking to on a podcast talking about the amount of exploitation that had happened when mining and even the agriculture. We think about agriculture as being something that's sustainable, and it is in many ways, and even traditional agriculture is important. But what I've realized now, recently I co-authored a book on Arikara ethnobotany, and I'm working with co-authoring another book called Arikara Corn and Traditional Agriculture. Was that even the traditional agriculture was really, really infused with a lot of spirituality. I mean, the women in our three tribes, before they even planted the seeds, used to sing to the seeds to get them ready to be born. And then before they went out to the gardens, they sang to the earth, and they sang. The Hidatsa women would sing to the corn spirits to call them to get ready for plantings, and they would come, as the snow went away. So I think about how all of those ceremonies and all of that lifestyle was prohibited and banned by the federal government and Christian missionaries when they came in. And in our lands, they came and they monocropped, planted all this wheat and corn and sunflowers. And of course, the bumper stickers that go around, thank a farmer if you're eating or something like that. And that's kind of been the narrative that we've seen out in the Great Plains area. But all the natural environment where you could collect wild seeds, wild plants for medicine and for food and for all kinds of ceremony, we're just tilled up, and the parking lots are put there, and of course, they were monocropped over by European sort of methods of farming. So when I think about environmental justice, that's what I think about. I think about, what it did to the original people of this land. And of course, pushed them out of the conversation too as well. I see that when people go to environmental justice conferences around the world, that Indigenous people have to fight to get a place at the table to talk about our own homelands where we live. We're not even represented. So I think that's the important thing, is settlers have to kind of, stop taking up so much space, and allow, Indigenous people to be a very important part of this conversation. Because what I'm saying is not new, and many Indigenous people understand exactly what I'm talking about in terms of, this whole history of what's happened with the environmental injustice. So I'll just say that much. I don't want to go on too long. So thank you.
Thank you. Others? Heather?
I also don't want to, I feel so humbled really to be part of this conversation with you all. So just wanted to make space for others, but thank you so much. What you just shared was really very touching to me. And I guess I think of environmental justice as a movement, and I also, I mean, you know, our organization's focused on strengthening the global food sovereignty movement, and I think they intersect really strongly. And that food sovereignty is an approach to achieving our strategy for achieving environmental justice. Food sovereignty means that people have the right to define their own food system, be that agricultural workers, fisher people, can't forget the waters, the oceans, and food workers, most of whom are BIPOC and Indigenous. So especially there's a focus on achieving food sovereignty, especially through the leadership of Indigenous and Black folks and other people of color. And someone asked, what is agroecology? So we see food sovereignty as being achieved only through agroecology, which is considered three things. It's a movement, it's a science, and it's a practice. It's referred to as the accumulation of ancestral and cultural peasant knowledge. And I think just exactly what you were referring to before, it's honoring the stewardship of the land that's been happening for millennia, listening and learning from those traditional practices, and also applying science and everyday practice on the land. And what agroecology, I think most importantly, is the difference between agroecology and say organic or sustainable agriculture is that it's really focused on communities organizing themselves and being both organized locally to demand these changes and to implement them, and also to connect up, nationally, transnationally, internationally. And it comes, the idea of food sovereignty comes out of La Via Campesina, which is the peasant way is what that means. And it's an international peasant movement, considered the biggest and strongest social movement in the world. It has had a huge impact on like international spaces like WTO protests, including there, but also within the United Nations is really making significant headway in terms of defining the rights of peasants and codifying those in international institutions. So it's both an international movement, but also something that, folks are practicing already, have been practicing, and are learning about in community. And I think social work obviously is about, being community organizers, right? And supporting health of communities. So I see it as very, very much linked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, I'm reminded that I was at the UN Environmental Conference in Rio back in '91, and then we had a conversation with some folks. And the biggest thing I brought out of there was that, we had been from a global issue looking at deforestation and how this was going to really change the climate and work and be bad for the environment and all these animals and plants that were being wiped out. And this gentleman shared that, we live here. And so this is a social justice issue, right? Be pushed off your land to have your land taken, genocide, in many ways. So it's just interesting that here, that's why that dates me. I think environmental justice to us is around the fact that we live, and many folks do live in an urban environment. And so that is an environment. And so what is the justice, that we need to try to work on, around there? And again, we've chosen food as a way. I was a former science teacher, taught nutrition, and I began to understand, right, the direct health relationship between food and health. And it's also about space. So how can we create a space in the city, a rapidly gentrifying space that can be really intentional about the culture that we try to build there, and how we try to serve folks there. And I think, if we're talking about social workers, and I was so happy to sort of get involved with this, right? Because social work is around trying to help people be healthy. And so if you can support people's ability to relieve their stress somehow, to eat better, I love this idea, is mindfulness, right? In terms of how do you actually start to control all the stuff that's going around, and so for me, a lot of that happened in the garden. So how can I share that with others? I think that was a piece that really, brought me to it, and it's sort of the foundation work. Now this work continues because we have young folks that are learning and taking over on this. So it's an evolving story about what our work is going to be. But it is really about justice, and I think environmental justice is justice on every level. So thank you.
So that number 2 question, what does environmental justice mean to me? And so I thought I'd try to focus a little bit because that's a huge question. And so what that means to me is the tribes have access to their treaty guaranteed natural resources. And that, just to take one example of that, is that fishing rights, of course, tribal fishing rights is a big issue here. And the Supreme Court affirmed a decision in 1979 called the Bolt decision, BOLDT, that said that, yes, indeed, the tribes do have a right to fish, and that the language of the treaty is to fish in common. And in those days, to fish in common, the judge said, would mean that 50% for the tribes and 50% for everybody else. So, but 50% of what? Because of our degradation of the environment, salmon and other fisheries have gone way, way down, even since, like, I fished back in 1979 one summer, and it's just really, I mean, it was tough then. Now it's really tough. So, so it's like, is the question, a question that's been forward is, okay, we have treaty rights, but it's like, if there's no fish, for instance, how can we exercise our treaty rights? And so another aspect of environmental justice from the tribal perspective is that the federal government needs to fulfill its trust responsibility to help work with tribes to protect things like natural resources. And the federal government, does that to different degrees, not going to criticize them too much. I mean, well, they could be criticized a lot, but they could also be complimented a lot for a lot of the work that's been done. And so one of the results is of various work that's been initiated by tribes, including treaty rights, which actually those treaty rights were affirmed in a case called US v. Washington. And so that, because that case came about because the federal prosecutor in this region said, oh, the state says that it has authorization to tell the tribes where they can fish, and it's really restricting them. So the federal government took on the case, and the tribes could not sue legally. They could not sue the state legally. Had to be because of the trust responsibility and other aspects of Indian law. So the state or the feds had to come in and do that. So another thing about environmental justice with relation to tribes is dams. And so it's like, okay, back in the day, a lot of dams were built, and it flooded a lot of tribal land, and it degraded the fisheries resource tremendously. And of course, two renewable resources that are really problematic for many people. I mean, it have its direct impacts on people, and of course, primarily people of color, are dams and nuclear power. So hey, great, it's renewable, but it's at a great cost. One of the issues that came up recently was that the lower Elwha tribe, just to the west of Port Angeles, they're on the Elwha River. There's 2 dams there that stopped the free flow of salmon up the river. In fact, they totally stopped it. And it was a very rich hunting ground or fishing ground. And so the tribes, these dams almost became useless over the years as the silt filled them up. So the tribe said, we want to get rid of these dams, or these dams should be gotten rid of. And there's a senator from the United States, former Senator Slade Gordon, who for some reason, well, for good reason, in his case, I mean, in his mind, had a real problem with tribes and tried to do what he could to dismantle tribal rights. So he said, oh, well, okay, well, if you can get people in Port Angeles to agree to take these dams down, then I'll consider it. So guess what? The tribe went in and did an educational campaign and got the people of Port Angeles to say, yeah, let's take these dams down. So those dams have been taken down, which is basically kind of a landmark thing to take out such big dams. So that is something that should always be kept in mind, is to redress these wrongs. And that would be environmental justice to some people. But of course, that justice word can be kind of problematic, because it's like, my justice isn't necessarily your justice. Like, is it justice for me to get my fish back, or for the tribes to get our fish back, and then for you to lose cheap electricity and to have to depend upon perhaps fossil fuels to make that up? So I guess I just want to put that forward. Environmental justice may be a problematic title for these issues that we talk about. So thanks for letting me speak and spout off for a few minutes.
Yeah, I like that point. I think that there are that these issues are not neutral, and that there's always politics behind it. I just, for my own self, I came to this work really more from a racial justice lens. I started my career out in Michigan and did work in the city of Detroit. And one of the things that really kind of stood out to me was, well, in some of the work that I did was just some of the lead levels in the children who live in the city. It was really something about close to, within the Head Start population, about 50% of the kids had a level of lead that was lead poisoning. And so, that was where my environmental justice work got started, kind of like what Ray was saying, within an urban environment. And, it was interesting because at that time, and this was probably about 20 years ago, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say conflict, but perhaps I would say that there was a different understanding of what environmental justice was between inner city, in this case, largely Black in Detroit, and suburban white populations in terms of what environmental justice was. For them, it was more conservation of green spaces. And for urban people, it was things like lead, asthma, other carcinogens that are killing people. My own work in my homeland, I just want to just say that, I want to make that tie for us between anti-racism and environmental justice work, because, like Michael and Jeff, I resonate with Indigenous ways of knowing and our own connection to land, and our how our culture and our cultural practices are tied to our land. And without our land and our inability to participate in our practices, that can lead to our own, I think, as Ray said, our genocidal extinction as people and as a culture, with culture. To presence the picture behind me, this is people always tell me, well, that's such a beautiful picture. Where is that? Is that in Hawaii? And I say, yeah, exactly. This is in Hawaii. It's on the island of Kaho'olawe, and it is the impression of a 500 megaton bomb that was used to mimic a nuclear explosion. For those of you who know, Kaho'olawe is one of our main islands. You can see it very clearly off of the coast of Maui. For those of you who have been on that side of Maui. So, environmental justice for me is about, in many ways, it's racial justice. I came to it from a racial justice lens. And today, my environmental justice work really lies in how can we preserve culture by sustaining our lands. In Hawaii, we say, "O maokea o kaina I ka pono," which means the life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. Our lives are inextricably tied to the land. And so I wanted to share that and see if anybody had comments or want to continue that line of conversation around racial justice and environmental justice.
If I could, I'd say a bit more, Michael. So I think it's really important, in a panel like this to kind of continue to underline, I think, the conclusion we're coming to. And I think it's when you ask the question, how is environmental justice related to racism and other larger issues? I think it's related to racism. It's clearly about racism. But for Indigenous people, I think, like both Michael and Jeff have mentioned, that I think it's a lot more about politics when it concerns Indigenous people. And here's the reason why. Indigenous people are the only people in the United States that hold treaty rights with the U.S. government. No other group holds that has treaty rights. And those treaties that were agreed to, people agreed to sort of give up land or waterway rights or all these kinds of things. And because of that, Indigenous people are recognized not as racial groups, but more as political entities. And that's really important, because sometimes we get lost in that whole thing about BIPOC or race and all those kinds of things. I think people don't understand that yet when they talk about it. I think it's one stream of race, but that's I think we have to correct that notion that Indigenous people are political groups that still have this relationship with the federal government, to the point where now we have our first Secretary of the Interior, who's an Indigenous woman, who's kind of relooking at a lot of these different kinds of things, right? In terms of land rights, water rights, those kinds of things. But, it's really important, I think, to say this too, because I don't think it's said enough that when Indigenous people were made wards of the federal government in this so-called trust relationship, the US being our trust agent, it enabled the US to steal our lands, our resources, although we don't call them resources, right? This is our, and all these things, that we lived upon, the lands. So the injustice has really been about settler colonialism, which has all been about eliminating the native. And that's where we have to be very careful, because there are settlers and there are Indigenous people. That needs to be very clear. And it should not be mixed up, with that idea that there's a separation between the two, and that are a bringing together, I should say, of the two. But this whole idea of the narrative, that Indigenous people were, given this label of being incompetent, unable to handle their own affairs, and with that, the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs committed generations and generations and generations of land theft, water theft, timber theft, all these different kinds of thefts that exist. So for me, I don't really believe, wholeheartedly, that environmental justice is possible until the U.S. honors its treaties, returns our land, our waters and resources, and we start back at this level playing field, right? I don't think it's possible. I think that's the important thing. I think that is happening, or not happening, I should say. And the other thing is maybe it's about class too, because I remember reading about how the rich folks were buying up all this land, and the billionaires in Silicon Valley and other rich people were buying property and land in New Zealand to get ready for the apocalypse, right? And so this is kind of, the thing that's happening that, we don't, it's under our, it's off our radar because we're not the rich, we're not the ultra wealthy. We don't get in those circles, we don't have those conversations. But we know where they spend their money, and we know how they're spending their money. And of course, they're increasing, their control and hold on, again, in Maori territory as well, buying all this land. Did the Maori sell that land to them? No, they didn't. Of course, they didn't sell that land to them. So these are the injustices that continue to occur on this political level more than I think on a racial level, because it's again something that we have to visit and revisit many times in order to kind of bring folks up to speed. So again, I'll just say that much.
Thank you. Excellent points.
Here, 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 here. Thank you. That's really, really important. Thank you.
So thank you all for helping us to expand and complicate our definitions of environmental justice and all of the different facets that phrase can entail or sometimes isn't bringing in. Another question we'd like to consider is, given all of these different fields and all of these different perspectives that can come into environmental justice, what has your experience been in working across disciplines, across cultures? Like how have you seen different groups come together to productively work towards this vision that we're setting for environmental justice?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. So back, I don't know, maybe in the 80s, the tribes and environmentalists, guess what? They didn't get along in a lot of circumstances. Environmentalists were really unhappy with the way that tribes exercised their treaty rights, the way they use various resources. So they'd go to court and sue the tribes. And it's like, the tribes are like, what are you doing, man? We got some of the same issues. So a story that I knew the people that have now since passed away, some of the principals, but Joe Dela Cruz, who was the chairman of the Quinault tribe and very active person in tribal issues and addressing them with the federal government and other entities. He and some others said, hey, we should connect with these environmentalists and talk to them about it. So it just so happened that he had sat on a plane next to a well-known environmentalist called Hazel Wolf, who there's a high school in Seattle that's named after her because of her great work. So she's a non-native person. And so he got her card. And then so he said, well, I'll call this lady up. And so try to make a long story short, they got together, and then the organization that I later worked for, American Friends Service Committee, they paid a young woman, Bernice Delorme, to drive herself and Hazel around the Northwest and visit the different tribal councils and talk to them about, hey, let's see what we can do to get together. And so they did, and they started working together against exploiters of natural resources. And one of the things that came out of that was that the corporations, they were like, oh, we can do what we want to do. Well, guess what? Judges kind of said, no, you can't. And so they they got together with tribes, and they formed an organization to be a sort of an intermediary called the Northwest Renewable Resource Center. And they did a lot of work to help bring corporations and counties together with tribes to try to figure out, so educate people, especially at the county level, about what's going on with tribes, what their rights are. And they were able to deal with a lot of issues before they got to places like court, which is, you talk about, it's supposed to be a justice system, but of course, if you lose, it doesn't seem like justice to you. So when they work together to kind of find a common solution, it can go really well. So I think that, you know, that's a good example. And there are various issues that have had similar results since then. Northwest Renewable Resources closed its doors down long ago because corporations didn't need it anymore, and they were the one that were coughing up the money for that. So, so thanks for letting me share.
Others?
I just got to say that of all the questions that were provided for us, the discussion topics, that was the hardest one for me to think about. So I don't know if that's, it's kind of, anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. Well, go
it's
ahead.
okay if I hop in
Yeah, please.
briefly. You know, being a science teacher and trying to look at systems thinking, it sparked just a very few, but I think deep things about environmental justice across disciplines, right? So if environmental justice is good food, then there's the science and there's the art of growing that food, right? If environmental justice is healthy soil, then there's a science, and we've been able to connect with UW soil scientists about testing the soil for urban pollutants. And then there's the art of trying to figure out what to do with that, the remediation, right? So I think that is sort of a science end, this is the fact, and then the art, the community end of what are we going to do? Are we going to add? We're going to grow on it. We're going to grow different things. What is it that how do we either remediate the soil or change our practice? And environmental justice is about safe spaces, right? So in our case, if you come to visit Yes Farm, and I hope that you do, you'll see we have an accessibility issue, right? The farm is a little bit below the sidewalk. And once you get to if you have mobility issues, then it's really tough to get down there. So that's one of our programs, is trying to get with urban planning, architecture, how do we create access, right? Again, environmental justice is access to those spaces. And then the environmental justice is about community. And so it's the art of creating community. How do you, in my case, trying to elevate young people that are good at that to try to create community that's healthy for themselves and healthy for everybody. So, in terms of, and I think it's going to take an interdisciplinary approach to solve these problems, to even to identify them, right? And so, the fact that the School of Social Work is willing to reach out to all these other groups and try to figure out how do we solve this, and even bring up that environmental justice is a social work issue, right? This is a step toward trying to get some to that. So, yeah, thank you.
So I'll say something too. I think I like what Raymond is saying, and of course what Jeff is saying too. And I think it's very important to think about change. I think how change comes about, and I think the most recent example of successful change came about after unfortunately and very sadly the death of George Floyd, where all these groups got together and they decided to raise some hell. And decided to change the narrative, right? And that kind of activism, we don't teach in social work. We don't. We talk about community development and building and stuff, but these weren't trained social workers. These were people out there with their mad as hell that saw the injustice, and they didn't want to deal with it any longer, right? They knew what was happening. Of course, they went out, they expressed themselves. They call them rioters, they call them this, terrorists, whatever they call it. But these people were expressing themselves in very important ways. They were toppling down these icons of colonialism all over the country. Even Canada was happening here. And it wasn't until people started doing those kinds of things that people, they started to break down these icons of colonialism, that some of these corporations began to fall in line and say, oh no, that's right. That's terrible that we've named this school or this college after this slaveholder, or we honored Columbus, or we did all these kinds of things. And same thing happened in Canada, with Ryerson, who was one of the people who architected residential schools in Canada. They tore his statue down in front of Ryerson University, and what they're doing now is renaming a lot of these places, and they're having these conversations with Indigenous people, and that came about by people just going into the streets, and of course they did what they needed to do. Now, some people say, "Oh, that's not good. That's terrible. Whatever." Well, I have known and worked on the mascot issue in the United States since 1972, when I was a freshman at the University of North Dakota. We worked so hard trying to change that thing, and the Washington Redskins and all these really this stereotypical and racist, hateful images of Indigenous people. Well, we went to court, we signed petitions, we stood in the streets, nothing happened. It wasn't until after George Floyd was murdered that the Washington Redskins decided to change their name. That to me was a paradigm shift that's still possible. It was made possible by not just BIPOC people, but allies, settler allies that came together with a common goal in mind, and that was change. It was accomplished, and it's still ongoing now because we're fighting this battle against this imaginary boogeyman called critical race theory. Right? It's ridiculous when you think about it, and that's the thing that's going to change the narrative, is by people coming together with that kind of heart, that kind of mind, and that kind of planning and that kind of activism. Right? We can't teach that in schools of social work, right? They shut down our faculties, and we'd lose our jobs if we taught people how to be effective in that kind of way. So I think that when you're talking about environmental justice, it's the same thing. We can't stand on the corners and protest and hold up signs, while the billionaires continue to contaminate the land, and the corporations begin to continue to exploit it and push people off their land, and climate change is creating climate refugees, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, we're at the edge of the cliff, folks, at the precipice, man. We're into the sixth extinction already. I mean, I don't know how much more it's going to take for us to kind of get people together to begin to mobilize and to make movements towards this really dramatic change that's required right now. So again, I think that's when I think about what happened with George Floyd. It was a terrible, horrible murder, but it showed people that if they could unite for a common cause for justice, things happen. So
Thank you. Heather, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you for that. You were kind of talking in the end about, just inspired me to share a little bit more about my background, which is that I was trained as an organizer by CISPAS, which is the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. So I really come to organizing through that global lens or transnational lens of and just if environmental justice is, obviously it happens on an international level, on global level. It's a global movement, and some of what we have to do is ask, what is our responsibility being situated in the United States, in the belly of the beast, where our government and our corporations are polluting the world and causing environmental injustice. So I think just thinking about ways of doing that. And I think the WTO protests were extraordinary because the WTO was undermining so many different, was in the center of so many different struggles. And it's interesting how, and unfortunate, but how, we work on confronting the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates as an individual, and how, this Thursday I'm doing a panel with Vandana Shiva, who's an incredible Indian food sovereignty activist who spoke at the WTO protests, was in Seattle in '99. And she just published a book on philanthrocapitalism, and just it's bringing together people around the world working on the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates, and how there's just all these different, I mean, the tentacles are just overwhelming, how much power he has and the foundation has, and which is hard. It's hard to confront. It's hard to get people to question charity and philanthropy, but I think that's a really important thing we have to do, is challenge the zillionaires, and challenge, that any kind of money that is comes from foundations is a positive thing, because it's absolutely not. So much damage is being done. So in a way, it's bringing folks together around a common enemy, if you will, to challenge Gates and other zillionaires doing so much trouble, so much damage in the world. And I think it's just really important to, there's like incredible indigenous-led struggles against pipelines and and mining, like in the North American continent, and it's so important to make the connection with the struggles against mining or pollution in other places. So that's one way I think that we can just internationalize our struggles. And I mean, the Via Campesina's main, the international movement of peasants that I mentioned earlier, for folks, La Via Campesina are new to that, their main chant is globalize the hope, globalize the struggle. And I think we have to be, of course, organizing in our own communities at the same time, trying to internationalize our struggles, and especially in the US, we have a particular responsibility. And I just wanted to say, as the white leader of a multiracial organization that, that has always had a white director, and most of our membership is white, although we are a multi-justice organization and strive to be that, our anti-racist work is both on the individual level, on the community level within the organization, but also our main sort of expression of that is solidarity work. So I mean, the majority of our work is in solidarity with people of color and working class led struggles, and in solidarity with the African-led food sovereignty movement on the continent. So that has been a model that, somewhat is an extension of what I learned from CISPAS, that we have a lot of power and responsibility being in the US, where these institutions are causing so much harm, and we can stand up and do something about it, and just trying to build those collective social movements, as you say, are so urgently needed across sectors, linking up. For example, food sovereignty is absolutely a climate justice issue, right? So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you.
So I see we're kind of getting close to the question and answer time. So I wanted to say one thing that I hope was brief. But so people on this call, I assume, are coming from all kinds of different professions, backgrounds, perspectives. So if you're interested in knowing what tribal perspectives are, especially in the Northwest region, on various issues, including child welfare, education, natural resources, environmental, climate justice, climate change, please go to the website for the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. That's the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. And their website name is ATNI tribes.org. And then what you can do is, when you get in there, is look for the place where it has the resolutions. And you can go and read the resolutions, and there's 3 conferences a year, 3 conventions a year where resolutions are passed. And so you can know that that's the regional tribe's position on these various issues. And so you can kind of see maybe we can be in support of these things, or we are in support, or interesting what their perspective is. So check that out when you get a chance. Thanks.
That's actually great, Jeff, because that's actually the question that we wanted to move into, which is, how can people get involved with this work? And if there's a specific work that you folks are involved with that they can get involved with right now, that would be great. But also just in general, I mean, like you just stated, what are some first steps for individuals who want to learn more about this topic, who may want to, look into some resources or concretely get involved?
I was just going to say it was a resolution against genetically engineered salmon that the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians passed that sort of brought that issue to our attention and, chose to, it was the leadership of Valerie Seagrass, who's Muckleshoot, who identified that as something that needed to be countered, but that was sort of what brought it to our attention and why we started working to amplify the work that she was doing or bring more attention to that. So, I mean, that was just one example that, it was something that was identified. It wasn't for us to lead the struggle, but we could educate about it and make a short film about it and invite her to speak at our big events. And, we've done great events on the UW campus, do a salmon cookout. I mean, there's just so many ways you can amplify the struggles. I think, whoops, sorry. And I'm not here just to promote my organization, but, we're volunteer run. I'm the only staff and we have interns like our great social work intern, Jeremy, but right now, just always looking for more folks to help us in our various food sovereignty campaigns. But I think in general, there's so many opportunities to volunteer and intern and just, support organizing happening around the state on these issues.
And feel free to plug away.
Yeah, I'll plug a bit, folks can definitely check out the website, Black Farmers Collective, .com. There's a link if you want to send us an email with questions. We're down at Yes Farm, which is, we're farming the freeway right away, just east of I-5 and south of Yesler. So 715 Yesler will map you to the bus stop, walk down the hill and see us on Saturdays 10 to 3. You don't have to work. You can just come and walk through there. It's actually open. You can come anytime. And just see what's going on, see if you want to get involved. That's how we're building community down there. So definitely welcome to come. I guess I can also, bounce off of Michael James Yellowbird's comments about critical race theory. And what you're seeing, of course, is white supremacy backlash to all the positive, my point of view, positive things that have happened, right? And so I think you'll see this with critical race theory, which is like a law school deal. It's just not, it's not. We're not really trying to brainwash kids, and voting rights, right? So I think we should look at these things as part of the system that's kept white supremacy going in the United States, and that this is not a constant journey toward better. There's better and worse and better and worse, and so we have to keep working on this, in our own ways. And I encourage folks to think about what that might be, both in the environmental justice issue and then certainly on racial justice. And I think I'm going to have to say political justice, right? If Indigenous people, because it's quite a racially mixed group, it's a political group. And so this is definitely, something new to me, and a way to look at, look at our brothers and sisters. Thank you.
I think if I could say something again, I think it's really important to think about context and how things that are that are kind of the reality today have had a past to them. And I'm thinking about, if people really want to understand the context of some of the things we've been talking about in terms of, Indian people, Indigenous people, and the land and the injustices, one only need to look back at Leonard Peltier Leonard Peltier, he's got a chance maybe to get freed by Biden, but if you really want to do something, get behind that push to free Peltier. And I'll tell you how it's related to the environment. Back in 1973, when all these activists, Leonard Peltier and others who converged upon Wounded Knee, what was going on at that time was that there was a lot of different kinds of corporations at the time, in vying for trying to get access to Indian lands, right? So they could get oil and gas and mining industries going, and that's pretty clear that was happening. South Dakota and North Dakota around coal, and in Montana with the Cheyenne with coal, and get at timber industries and stuff. Activism at that time to try to stop that, by indigenous people for indigenous rights and sovereignty and renegotiating treaties is what actually led the standoff in Wounded Knee at that time, 1973. That's how Leonard Peltier ended up in prison for, over 40 years. 40 years now. He's been there for years and years. When the U.S. has been releasing all kinds of people, Peltier remains, in prison. But it was related to that whole thing around the lack of respect for the sovereignty of indigenous people. And the same thing has happened when I think about all these people, the protesters for the mask mandates and vaccine mandates. I mean, in Canada, for example, they're handling these truckers with kid gloves. When you go down to Standing Rock and you saw people at Standing Rock, I mean, they tased them and they shot them with rubber bullets. They pepper sprayed them and tear gassed them, beat them. And through, I don't know how many people in jail, and they're still paying fines today. I was down there when I was living down there in North Dakota in Fargo. Some of the people, the church people came and they asked, like, what can we do? I said, why don't you go to your governor and ask him to pardon all these people that they were thrown in jail, and pardon them, for standing up for the environment, right? They didn't even want to do that. They didn't want to talk to the governor about that, but they really want to do something for Indian people, but they don't want to stick their necks out to do that kind of thing, even though they had his ear. They could have went and talked to the governor. They wouldn't do that. Well, it's not something we can do, right? But when you think about that, that's the history, I think, that people really, if people want to start, they need to learn the history of what's happened with indigenous activism, because it's always been about the land. Read any of Winona LaDuke's books. It's always about the land. Read what happened with Leonard Peltier. It's about the land. Read what happened at Standing Rock. It's about the land, right? It's about the water. So I think that's how people can really inform themselves. I wish there was someone would develop a course on that, about indigenous activism and these things, and detail that history, because I think that would be valuable for social work students to learn that history. So, and of course, and what Jeff was talking about too was earlier, the fishing that was going on in Washington State. I know a lot of those people I never met, some of those folks, but we knew that because in the late 80s, when I was a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, we were having the same kind of fish wars in northern Wisconsin. It was terrible what was happening to these people that were guaranteed, this is again a colonial system and a government that was actually giving people the right to fish on their own lands through court decisions, right? Like the Bolt decision. Who has that permission to really tell people that, yeah, it's okay to fish on your own land, it's okay to take, fish from, or it's okay to hunt there, that sort of thing? Only a colonial institution and structure would do that kind of thing. And that is the process and the structure of settler colonialism. And if people want to learn more about that, they dive into the literature on settler colonialism as well, because it's always about the land when you start looking at settler colonialism. So I'll say that much.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and those ideas. At this point, we do have a little bit of time left. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask the panelists, please feel free to throw them into the chat. And also thank you for everyone who's been, especially Heather, for throwing all of these resources into the chat. It's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Hope it's not too much.
I don't see any questions yet, but one question I'd love to just kind of throw out there as we're starting to wrap up is what's one thing that brings you hope about the work in this movement?
I think we've seen some major changes in I don't know, in the last, like Occupy maybe was starting with like a movement of just identifying, being able to speak the word capitalism in our, now in like common way that we talk about what's wrong, like naming the root causes, that. And then now with how effective the Black Lives Matter movement has been, I feel like racial justice is just, I mean, it's just amazing how much, the backlash is terrible, but expected. And just, I feel like it's just so much more essential to what people understand and like root causes of problem, what we're fighting against and what we're fighting for. It's just been articulated in new ways really powerfully. So that gives me hope. And just, I mean, I am shocked how politicized our interns are. There's so much more aware even of like global perspectives. And I kid you not, over and over, they're getting radicalized on TikTok, which I just didn't know was a thing. Showing my age, but like students I just find are like, proudly socialist. Not that I'm saying that that's like the end all be all, but just like are politicized and comfortable with expressing pretty radical politics in a way that I, was not the case when I was a student at Evergreen and UW or whatever. So the youth always give us hope. Always leading movements, right? And decolonization is another concept that is central. And I think, there's struggle around what it means and the importance of it, but that's another idea that I feel like is very central in people's consciousness now that wasn't recently.
I am given hope by our success at attracting some very intelligent young people who see this urban farming and community organizing as a path for themselves, right? And the need to help folks grow better food and create a more local sustainable food system. So I'm encouraged by the folks that are rising to this occasion. We just have to set the table a little bit with our resources and our wisdom and our resources, and then try to and try to let them go. So that does make me hopeful.
A lot like rest of you, what you're saying, Heather, and of course Raymond. I see movements that are not in the mainstream, that are not in the paper, and I've been very impressed by a lot of young people and things that they're doing these days. There's so many, in Canada, there's so many young folks that are fighting against pipelines in British Columbia, for instance, and I know some of these young people, and they don't get on the news every night, but they are there. They're working hard. And they're facing all kinds of odds, against, RCMP and provincial officers and so on. And there's a lot of hate crimes committed against those folks. So, and they believe in what they're doing, and that's to me very admirable to see. And a lot of them are women-led, Indigenous women-led. So it's very important, that we continue to see that, because within our traditions, many traditions, women are the caretakers of the water and other kinds of things in different tribal groups. And I see young people that I've had as students participating outside of their professions or outside of what they do, and in groups. And I really like that, what Ray was saying, that I see a lot of movement in different parts of the country where there's a lot of folks are dealing with food security indigenous food security and sovereignty. And they're really moving toward that kind of thing. And there are a lot of good ideas. So I think that in itself, is really, I think, a hopeful thing and needs a lot of encouragement, really a lot of encouragement. So I'm really happy to see that that going on, and that gives me hope. So.
I don't know. I don't want to talk about that for some reason, but let's see. One of the things I was thinking, a couple things. One is, Ray, when you were talking, I thought about how people often say, well, it's kind of like this, somehow the world has been socialized or acculturated to think like, I need to help the Indians. I need to help the poor Indians. And it probably was more that way when I was younger. But I didn't remember hearing people say, I need to help the poor Chicanos. I need to help the poor Black people. You don't hear that the same way, like this paternalistic thing. It doesn't seem like to me. So that's one thought I had. And another thought I don't know if you have a reflection on this, Dr. Yellowbird, is, we talk about treaty rights, the tribes have treaty rights. Well, guess who else has treaty rights? The non-Indians of this land have treaty rights. That's why they have this land, because of the treaty rights that they are subject to say that this land is theirs, that it's come down that way. And so protecting our treaty rights is protecting your treaty rights. And it just so happens that non-Indians have a lot more power. They have a lot bigger military and police force that can kind of enforce their will. But if somebody came in and said, well, your treaty rights, there's violations here, so we're going to take this land back. We're going to give it back to the tribes. How would you feel?
Happy? Well, I think I know it's really an important it's a really important idea, Jeff, because one of the main phrases that's happening up here in Canada with Truth and Reconciliation is that elders have said, we're all treaty people. At first, I didn't like that when I first heard that. Like, what do they mean by that? But then I understood what they said is that white folks, white settlers, have a responsibility to live up to those treaties too, and to treat those treaties, as sacred pacts and agreements between Indigenous people and themselves. So they're not out of the loop. They can't say, well, my government did this. They are part of that government that those treaties are made with. So they have a responsibility, is what the elders say up here. These Indigenous elders say, we're all treaty people. Read those treaties and remember what your responsibility is. To keep, keep our lands clean and don't exploit our, our waters and the people and so on and that sort of thing. So it is a mantra up here in Truth and Reconciliation. And I think that's what the United States needs. I'm glad I'm in Canada. I'm glad I'm here because I see it from a very different viewpoint. The U.S. more than ever needs a truth and reconciliation, a revolution happening. And again, it's very difficult to educate people to become allies, unless you catch it on a phone, where you see somebody's rights being violated, like George Floyd, and killed, because people have no idea this is happening to Black people. They have no idea it's happening to Indigenous people. No idea it's happening to Chicanos and Chicana people, or Latinx people, whatever it is, or transgendered people, unless they see it in person. So this is the idea: is that it has to be exposed in Truth and Reconciliation commissions. Those have to happen. And what it's done up here is it's exposed, decades and decades and decades of this this oppression and this uncontrolled, greed and the hate crimes that were committed against First Nation people in Canada. We have not had that reckoning in the United States, and you need it now more than ever. Truth and reconciliation is critical if you want to move towards environmental justice. You got to have context to this. You got to have context.
Ryan, I was going to say, should I close it out? Should I
Yeah.
go ahead and close this out? Great. You know, I just want to echo what everyone else has said. I also want to say that for myself, the hope that I have is that I think at one point there were over 100 some people in this webinar, which tells me a number of things. One, you know, just the wonderful planning that was done. So thank you so much for Ryan, Carrie, Arden, Stan. Hope I'm not missing anyone. Ray, for helping us to plan this event. It also tells me that there's great interest in continuing to have these conversations, and we have 2 other panels that are also on the docket. If you want to be a part of or join our organization, Social Workers for Environmental Justice, we encourage you to contact us and be in touch with us and help us to create a more viable organization. I would love for those of you who are in the field of social work and are interested, there is a grand challenge on climate change and environmental justice that I'm on the advisory committee of, and you can learn more about that by going to Grand Challenges for Social Work. And I can't tell you which grand challenge it is, but you'll note which one it is. And that's another way to get involved with these issues on a national basis within social work. And there's more organizations being put into the chat. That being said, Ryan, any last words?
Just again, thank you to everyone for sharing your wisdom and your time and helping us to really lay the foundation for this series. It's incredibly important, and we greatly appreciate you joining us for that. There have been some issues with the chat, with the link for the evaluation. So just know that there will be a follow-up email that will have a link for that. So if you need to fill out the evaluation for the CEUs, you can find it there. And then for anyone interested in joining the Social Workers for Environmental Justice, we're going to have a meeting in about a week and a half, and you should be receiving an email about that if you're a UW School of Social Work student in the next day or two. Otherwise, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my chat in my email in the chat right now, and you can do that as well.
Thank you, everyone.